Two Bodies on a Barge by George Simenon in the Maigret saga. The lock-keeper of Le Coudray was a lean, depressed-looking fellow in a corduroy suit with drooping moustaches and a suspicious eye, like a typical estate bailiff. He made no distinction between Maigret and the 50 other people, gendarmes, journalists, policemen from Corbeil and representatives of the Department of Public Prosecution, to whom he had told his story over the past 2 days. And as he spoke, he kept a watchful eye upstream and downstream over the grey-green surface of the Seine. It was November. The weather was cold, and a bleak pale sky was reflected in the water. I had to get up at 6 this morning to look after my wife, and Maigret reflected that these decent, sad-eyed men are always the ones who have sick wives to look after. While I was lighting the fire, I thought I heard something, but it was only later, while I was up on the first floor preparing her poultice, that I realized somebody was calling. I came downstairs, I went out onto the lock, and there I could vaguely make out a dark mass against the weir. "What's up?" I shouted. "Help!" somebody called out hoarsely. "What are you doing there?" I asked, and he went on shouting, "Help!" I took my wherry to go after him. I could see it was the Astrolabe. As it was beginning to get light at last, I made out old Clausen's on deck. I could take my oath that he was still tight and that he had no idea what his barge was doing up against the lock. The dog was loose, and indeed I asked him to hold on to it, and that's it. The important thing, from his point of view, was that a barge had run into his lock and might have damaged it if the current had been stronger. He seemed totally unconcerned by the fact that, apart from the drunken old carter and a big Alsatian dog, there had been nobody on board but 2 corpses, a man and a woman, both hanged. The Astrolabe had been released and was now moored 150 meters away, guarded by a constable who kept himself warm pacing up and down the towpath. It was an old barge without a motor, a stable boat, as they call those barges that travel along canals with their horses on board. Passing cyclists turned to stare at this greyish hull, about which all the papers had been talking for the past 2 days. As usual, when Superintendent Maigret had been brought in, it was because there were no fresh clues to be noted. Everybody had gone into the case, and the witnesses had already been questioned 50 times, first by the local gendarmerie, then by the Corbeil police, by magistrates, and by reporters. "You'll see it was Émile Gradou who committed the crime," he had been told, and Maigret, after spending 2 hours questioning Gradou, was back on the scene of the incident, his hands in the pockets of his heavy overcoat, looking cross and staring at the gloomy landscape as though he was considering buying a plot of land there. The interest lay not in the lock at Coudray, into which the barge had crashed, but at the other end of the reach, 8 kilometers higher upstream at the lock of La Citanguette. The setting here was much the same as lower down. The villages of Morsang and Saint-Port were on the opposite bank, a longish way off, so that there was nothing to be seen but the quiet water with copses beside it and the occasional scar of an old gravel pit. But at La Citanguette there was a bistro, and boats did their utmost to spend the night there. It was a real boatman's bistro where they sold bread, canned goods, sausage, tackle and oats for the horses. And that was really where Maigret conducted his inquiry, without appearing to do so, taking a drink from time to time, sitting down by the stove or taking a turn outside, while the patron, who was so fair as to be almost an albino, watched him with a slightly ironical respect. About that Wednesday evening, the following facts were known. When it was beginning to get dark, the Aiglon 7th, a small tug from the upper Seine, had brought her 6 lighters, like a brood of ducklings, up to the Citanguette lock. It was drizzling at the time. When the boats were moored, the men foregathered as usual in the bistro for a drink, while the lock-keeper took in his cranks. The Astrolabe came round the river bend only half an hour later, by which time darkness had fallen. Old Arthur Aerts, the skipper, was at the wheel, while Clausen's walked along the towpath in front of his horses with his whip over his shoulder. Then the Astrolabe had moored behind the string of boats, and Clausen's had taken his horses on board. At that point, nobody had paid attention to them. It was 7 o'clock at least, and everyone had finished eating when Aerts and Clausen's came into the bistro and sat down by the stove. The skipper of Aiglon 7th was doing most of the talking, and the two old men did not speak. The white-haired patronne, with a baby in her arms, served them with 4 or 5 glasses of marc, but she had taken little notice of them. That was how it had been, Maigret now realized. All these people were more or less acquainted with one another. They would come in with a brief gesture of greeting and sit down without a word. Sometimes a woman would come in just to buy provisions for next day and then to warn her husband, as he sat there drinking, "Don't be too late back." That had been the case with Ertz's wife Emma, who had bought bread, eggs, and a rabbit. From that point onwards, every detail acquired crucial importance. Every piece of evidence became extremely valuable. And so Maigret persisted. "You're sure that when he left about 10 o'clock, Arthur Ertz was drunk?" "Quite tight as usual," the proprietress replied. "He was a Belgian, a good fellow on the whole, who always sat in his corner saying nothing and went on drinking till he'd just got strength enough. Left to go back to his boat. And Claeson's the carter. He could take a bit more. He stayed about a quarter of an hour longer. Then he went off after coming back for his whip, which he'd forgotten." So far, so good. It was easy to picture the banks of the Seine at night. Below the lock, the tug with its 6 lighters behind it, then Ertz's barge, with a lamp hanging over each boat and the steady drizzle pouring down over it all. About 9:30, Emma had gone back on board the barge with her provisions. At 10, Ertz had gone back himself, quite tight, as the patron had said, and at 15:15, the carter had at last made his way back to the Astrolabe. I was only waiting for him to leave to close down, because boatmen go to bed early and there was nobody else left. So much was reliable evidence and could be confirmed, but it was all. After that, not the smallest piece of exact information. At 6 in the morning, the skipper of the tug had been surprised not to see the Astrolabe behind his lighters, and a little later he had noticed that the moorings had been cut. At the same moment, the lock-keeper at Le Coudray, who was looking after his sick wife, had heard the shouts of the old carter, and soon afterwards had discovered that the barge had run into his weir. The dog was running loose on the deck. The carter, woken up by the collision, knew nothing, and declared that he had been asleep all night in his stable as usual. Only in the cabin at the back of the boat, Ertz's body was discovered. He had been hanged, not with a rope, but with the dog's chain. Then, behind a curtain that concealed the wash basin, his wife Emma was found hanging too. She had been hanged with a sheet taken from the bed. And that was not all, since just before setting forth, the skipper of the Aiglon 7th, after vainly calling for his stoker Émile Gradout, discovered that the man had disappeared. Gradout was the murderer. Everybody was convinced of it, and that very evening the newspapers were full of such headlines as "Gradout seen prowling round Seine-Port," "Manhunt in Forest of Rougeau," "Ertz's hoard still not found." For all evidence went to prove that old Ertz had had a hoard, and indeed everyone agreed on the sum, 100,000 francs. It was a long yet quite simple story. Ertz, who was 60 and had 2 grown-up married sons, had married as his second wife Emma, a tough Strasbourgeoise 20 years his junior. Things were not going at all well between the couple. At every lock they stopped at, Emma would grumble about the miserliness of the old man, who scarcely gave her enough to eat. "I don't even know where he keeps his money," she would say. "He wants his sons to have it when he dies. And meanwhile I have to kill myself looking after him and steering the boat. Not to mention—" She would add crude details, sometimes in front of Ertz himself, while he just shook his head stubbornly. Then, after she had left, he would mutter, "She only married me for my 100,000 francs, but she's going to be disappointed." Emma would comment, furthermore, as though his sons needed it to live on. In fact, the elder son, Joseph, was the skipper of a tugboat at Antwerp, while Theodore, with his father's help, had bought a fine self-propelled barge, the Marie France. He had been notified of his father's death while passing through Maastricht in Holland. "But I'm going to find those 100,000 francs of his—" She would tell you all this out of the blue, when she'd only known you 5 minutes, giving the most intimate details about her old husband and adding cynically, "He surely can't suppose that it was out of love that a young woman like myself—" And she was unfaithful to him. The evidence was indisputable. Even the skipper of the Aiglon 7 knew about it. I can only tell you what I know, but it's a fact that during the fortnight we were lying idle at Alfortville and the Astrolabe was being loaded, Émile Gradout often went to meet her, even in broad daylight. So what next? Émile Gradout, 23 years of age, was a bad character, that was obvious. He had, in fact, been caught after 24 hours, half-starved, in the forest of Rougeau, less than 5 kilometers from La Citronguette. "I've done nothing," he yelled at the policeman, as he tried to ward off their blows. A nasty little ruffian with whom Maigret had been closeted for 2 hours in his office and who kept stubbornly repeating, "I've done nothing." "Then why did you run away?" "That's my business." As for the examining magistrate, convinced that Gradout had hidden the hoard in the forest, he had fresh searches made there in vain. There was something infinitely dreary about it all, as dreary as the river, which reflected the same sky from morning till night, or those strings of boats that announced their arrival with a blast from a hooter, one blast for each barge being towed, as they threaded their way into the loch in an endless stream. Then, while the women stayed on deck to look after the children and keep an eye on the movements of the boat, the men went up to the bistro for a drink and then walked slowly back. "It's plain sailing," one of his colleagues had said to Maigret, and yet Maigret, as sullen as the Seine itself, as sullen as a canal in the rain, had returned to his loch and could not bring himself to leave it. It's always the same story. When a case seems too clear-cut, nobody bothers to probe it in detail. Everybody agreed that Gradout was the criminal, and he had such a villainous look about him that it seemed self-evident. Nonetheless, the results of the post-mortem had now come in, and they led to some curious conclusions. Thus, in the case of Arthur Aerts, Dr. Paul said, "Slight bruising at the base of the chin, from the state of rigor. Mortis and the contents of the stomach, it can be specified that death by strangulation occurred between 10 and 10:30 p.m. Now, Aerts had gone back on board at 10 o'clock. According to the white-haired patron, Claussens had followed him a quarter of an hour later, and Claussens declared that he had gone straight into his cabin. Was there a light in the Aerts' cabin? I don't know. Was the dog tied up? The poor old fellow had thought for a long time, but had finally made a helpless gesture. No, he didn't know. He hadn't noticed. How could he have foretold that it would matter so much what he did that particular evening? He had been drowsy with drink as usual. He slept in his clothes on the straw, lying cosily beside his horse and his mare. You heard no noise? He didn't know. He couldn't have known. He had gone to sleep, and when he woke up he had found himself in mid-stream, up against the weir. At this point, however, there was a piece of evidence. But could it be taken seriously? It came from Madame Couturier, the wife of the skipper of the Aiglon 7th. The head of the Corbeil police had questioned her like everyone else before letting the train of boats carry on its journey towards the Loing Canal. Maigret had the report in his pocket. Q. Did you hear anything during the night? A. I wouldn't swear to it. Q. Tell us what you heard. A. It's so uncertain. I woke up at one point and looked at the time on my alarm clock. It was 11:45. I thought I heard people speaking near the boat. Q. Did you recognize the voices? A. No. But I thought it must be Gradout meeting Emma. I must have fallen asleep immediately after. Could one rely on this? And even if it was true, what did it prove? Below the loch, the tugboat and its 6 lighters and the Astrolabe had been lying quiet that night, and, as regards Aerts, the report was definite. He had died of strangulation between 10 and 10:30 p.m. But things became more complicated when it came to the second report, the one about Emma. The left cheek shows contusions produced either by a blunt instrument or by a violent blow with someone's fist. Death, due to asphyxia by hanging, must have taken place at about 7 a.m. And Maigret became ever more deeply absorbed in the slow, ponderous life of La Citronguette, as though only there was he capable of thought. A self-propelled barge flying a Belgian flag reminded him of Theodore, Aerts' son, who must by now have reached Paris. At the same time, the Belgian flag suggested the thought of gin. For on the table in the cabin there had been found a bottle of gin, more than half empty. Somebody had made a thorough search of the cabin itself, and even tore open the mattress covers, scattering the flock stuffing. Obviously in an attempt to find the hidden hoard of 100,000 francs. The first investigators had declared, "It's quite simple. Emile Gradout killed Aerts and Emma, then he got drunk and hunted for the treasure which he hid in the forest." Only? Yes. Only Dr. Paul, in his post-mortem on Emma's body, had found in her stomach all the gin that was missing from the bottle. Clearly, since Emma had drunk the gin, it couldn't have been Gradout. Sure, the investigators had replied. Gradout, after killing Aerts, had made the woman tipsy in order to overcome her more easily, for she was a strong creature, don't forget. So that if they were right, Gradout and his mistress must have stayed on board from 10 or 10:30 p.m., the time of Aerts's death, until midnight or 1 a.m., the time of Emma's. It was possible, of course. Everything was possible. Only Maigret wanted, somehow or other, to get to understand the Barge's way of thinking. He had been as harsh as the rest with Emile Gradout. For 2 hours he had grilled him thoroughly. To begin with, he had tried the wheedling method, la chansonnette, as they said at the Quai des Orfèvres. "Listen, old fellow, you're involved, that's clear. But to be frank with you, I don't believe you killed the pair of them. I've done nothing. You didn't kill them, that's for sure. But admit that you knocked the old fellow about a bit. It was his own fault, of course. He caught you together, and so in self-defense. I've done nothing. As for Emma, of course you didn't touch her since she was your woman. You're wasting your time. I've done nothing." Afterwards, Maigret had become harsher, even threatening. "Oh, so that's how it is. Well, we shall see if once you're on that boat with the 2 bodies." But Gradout had not even flinched at the prospect of a reconstruction of the crime. "Whenever you like." "I've done nothing." "All the same, when we find the money you've put away somewhere." Then Emile Gradout gave a smile of pity, an infinitely superior smile. That evening, the only vessels moored at La Citanguette were one motorized barge and a stable boat. By the lower lock, a policeman was still on duty on the deck of the Astrolabe, and he was greatly surprised when Maigret, climbing up on board, announced, "I haven't time to go back to Paris. I shall sleep here." The soft lapping of water could be heard against the hull, and the footsteps of the policeman as he paced the deck for fear of going to sleep. The poor man began to wonder whether Maigret was not going out of his mind, for he was making as much noise, all alone inside the boat, as if the 2 horses had been let loose in the hold. "Excuse me, officer." Maigret emerged from the hatchway. "Could you possibly get hold of a pickaxe for me?" Get hold of a pickaxe at 10 o'clock at night in such a spot? However, the policeman woke up the sad-looking lock-keeper, who, being a gardener, owned a pickaxe. "What does your super want to do with it?" "Blessed if I know." And they exchanged significant glances. As for Maigret, he went back, into the cabin with his pickaxe, and for an hour after that, the policeman heard muffled blows. "Look here, officer!" It was Maigret again, sweating and out of breath, thrusting his head through the hatchway. "Go and put through a phone call for me. I'd like the examining magistrate to come as early as possible tomorrow morning and have Emile Gradout brought along." The lock-keeper had never looked so lugubrious as when he guided the examining magistrate to the barge, while Gradout followed, flanked by a couple of policemen. "No, I swear I don't know anything." Maigret was asleep on the Aerts's bed. He did not even apologize, and seemed unaware of the magistrate's stupefaction at the sight of the cabin. The floorboards had been lifted. Underneath, there was a layer of cement, but this had been smashed with the pickaxe, and the mess was indescribable. "Come in, Monsieur le Juge. I was very late getting to bed, and I haven't had time to tidy myself up yet." He lit a pipe. He had found some bottles of beer somewhere, and he poured himself a drink. "Come in, Gradout. And now?" "Yes, now?" asked the magistrate. "It's quite simple," Maigret declared, puffing at his pipe. "I'll explain to you what happened the other night. You see, there was one thing that struck me from the first. Old Aerts had been hanged with a chain and his wife with a sheet. You'll soon understand. Study police records, and I'll swear you'll never find a single case of a man hanging himself with a wire or a chain. It may be odd, but it's so. Suicides are sensitive people, and the thought of those links bruising their throats and pinching the skin of their necks. So Arthur Aerts was murdered. That's my conclusion, yes, particularly since the bruise that was noticed on his chin seems to prove that the chain, having been slipped round his neck from behind while he was drunk, struck his face first. I don't see— Wait a minute. Now note that his wife, on the other hand, had been hanged with a twisted sheet. Not even a rope, whereas there are plenty of them on board a boat. No, a sheet off a bed, which is the gentlest way of hanging oneself, so to speak. And that means that she hanged herself. She even had to swallow half a litre of gin to get up courage, whereas normally she never drank. Remember the forensic report. I remember it. So we have one murder and one suicide. The murder committed at about 10:15, the suicide at midnight or 1 a.m., and that makes everything as clear as daylight. The magistrate was watching him somewhat suspiciously, and Emile Gradout with ironical curiosity. For a long time now, Maigret went on, Emma, who had not got what she hoped for from her marriage to old Aerts, and who was in love with Emile Gradout, had been obsessed by one idea: to get hold of the hoard and run away with her lover. Suddenly an opportunity arose. Aerts came home dead drunk. Gradout was close by, on board the tug. She'd already noticed, when she went to buy her provisions in the bistro, that her husband was pretty tipsy, so she unfastened the dog and waited, with the chain all ready to be slipped round the man's neck. But, the magistrate objected, presently, let me finish. Now Aerts is dead. Emma, elated with her triumph, runs to fetch Gradout. Don't forget, at this point, that the wife of the tugboat skipper had heard voices close to her boat at 11:15. Isn't that true, Gradout? It's true. The couple come on board to look for the treasure, search everywhere, even inside the mattress, but fail to find those 100,000 francs. Is that true, Gradout? It's true. Time passes and Gradout grows impatient. He even wonders, I'd be willing to bet if he's not been had, if those 100,000 francs really exist. Emma swears they do, but what use are they if they can't be found? So they keep on searching. Then Gradout gets fed up. He knows he'll be accused of the crime. He wants to clear off. Emma wants to go with him. Excuse me, the magistrate tried to put in. Presently, I tell you she wants to go off with him, and since he has no desire to be burdened with a woman who hasn't even any money, he solves the problem by knocking her out with his fist. Having floored her, he cuts the moorings of the barge. Is that true, Gradout? This time Gradout seemed reluctant to reply. That's about all, Maigret concluded. If they had discovered the treasure, they'd have gone off together, or else they'd have tried to make the old man's death look like suicide. Since they've failed to find it, Gradout takes fright and roams through the countryside trying to take cover. Emma, when she comes round, finds the boat drifting downstream and the hanged man swinging by her side. No hope left for her, not even the hope of escape. It would mean waking Clausens to guide the barge with the boat hook. In short, the whole thing has been a fiasco, and she decides to kill herself. Only as her courage fails her, she drinks first and then takes a soft sheet from the bed. Is this true, Gradout? Asked the magistrate, watching the young thug. Since the super says so. But wait a minute, the magistrate objected. What is to prove that he didn't find the treasure and, in order to keep it— Then Maigret merely kicked aside some pieces of cement and disclosed a hiding place in which lay Belgian and French gold coins. Do you understand now? More or less, the magistrate muttered without much conviction. And Maigret, filling a fresh pipe, growled, One had to know in the first place that they use a cement foundation for repairing old barges. Nobody had told me that. Then, with a sudden change of tone, The oddest thing about it is that I've counted, and there really are 100,000 francs. A peculiar household, don't you think? Thank you very much for listening to this story. narrated by Jason Fraser. Don't forget to subscribe to the Detective Tales channel and be sure to leave a comment.